Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's such a joy and an honor to have you with us. Thank you. My name is Maurizio Benazzo.
My name is Zaya Benazzo, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this, I would say, very timely conversation. Yes. I think we all feel what's happening in our world. There is agitation, there is a lot of old wounds for many of us that are surfacing. Many of us carry wounds from our lineages that have experienced war and colonialism and genocides, and it feels like they're very much in our collective field, very potent and very present. So the conversation today feels very timely. War's long shadow, generational grief, and narrative justice. Today we have two very special guests with us, trauma therapist and educator Linda Tai, and writer and cultural worker and an activist, Jungwon Kim. They will help us explore today this vast topic from their life experience, from their work, and help us grapple and face and be with what's happening today in our world. So share their wisdom and experience. So welcome both. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And we will be both in the background. And if you need us for anything, just call us. But we're passing this conversation to you now. Welcome.
Thank you, Zaya. Thank you, Maurizio. I'm just going to take a moment to place my hand on my heart. I have been told that when your heart beats very fast, it's your inner applause cheering you on. Yes. And I also recognize that there's a collective heartbeat at the moment, and we can choose to call it anxiety, we can choose to call it distress, or we can choose to call it our inner applause that is cheering us collectively together and onwards. And so I'll spend a couple of minutes introducing myself, and then Jungwon will do the same, and then we'll move into context setting for the rest of today. So I'm a trauma therapist. Tên tôi là Thái Kim Ngọc, cha tôi tên là Thái Văn Nam, mẹ tôi tên là Hương Thu Hà. Tôi rất vui và hân hạnh có được cơ hội hôm nay cùng các bạn. I greet you and your ancestors with respect. I'm a trauma therapist and educator. I specialize in brain and body-based modalities for addressing complex developmental trauma, and my work centers on healing the intergenerational impacts of historical trauma, centering adult children of refugees and immigrants and those who have experienced forced displacement. And so this includes descendants of residential school survivors, as well as those who have fled abuse and neglect within their families of origin. And I come to you today from the Dene Athabasca land of the Middle Tanana Valley, also known as Fairbanks, Alaska. This April 30, 2025 is the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. And it has taken me my entire lifetime to make sense of myself and my life and the impact of war upon myself and my family. Throughout my teens and my adult years, I really struggled. I was expelled from high school due to truancy, drug abuse. My 20s was a relational mess. I was looking for love in all the wrong places. I've struggled to hold a job for most of my life, and yet I tell people that I have been successfully self-employed since the age of 24. And yet somewhere amidst all of that messiness, I still sought to find the origin story that would help me to make sense of myself and my life. I was born 2 years after the end of the Vietnam War. I was born in southern Vietnam to two parents whose lives were backdropped by war, by the US Vietnam War and by the French Vietnam War before that. I am a former child refugee. my family sought refuge. And in 1979, 4 years after the fall of Saigon and 4 years into communism, my 26-year-old father, my 19-year-old mother, who was 6 months pregnant with my little sister, and my 2-year-old self fled Vietnam in search of refuge. The journey was treacherous. It was trauma-filled across land and sea, and we made it to a refugee camp in Malaysia where we lived for 6 months. My little sister was born there. We were then sponsored out to Australia under a pilot rural resettlement scheme and arrived in late 1979 into Tumut, a town of 7,000 people and one set of traffic lights, with 3 other Vietnamese families. And after 2 years, my family then made the decision to move to the big city of Melbourne in search of community. Despite the struggles in my adolescent years, I still made it to college and I studied modern Vietnamese history and modern Chinese history, Vietnamese language, Mandarin Chinese, because I was in search of that origin story that would help me to make sense of myself and my life. And my college professors, both Anglo-Saxon and Vietnamese and Chinese, they knew why I wanted to know, and they knew why I didn't know, and they didn't need to ask why. I'm going to hand it over to you now, Jungwon.
Thank you, Linda. So much came up for me just even listening to your introduction, and I'm so honored to be in conversation with you. My name is Jungwon Kim, and I am currently a guest on unceded Lenape land, otherwise known as Brooklyn, New York City. I am a mother, I am a writer, a cultural worker, an organizer and Sangha builder. And I have worked in the field of human rights and environmental advocacy for more than 20 years now. I'm also a second generation Korean American. So that means I was born in the United States. And I am the first citizen in our family, actually. I'm a so-called birthright citizen. And both of my parents were born under Japanese occupation in Korea. And then when they were school-age children, they experienced that brief 5-year window after the end of Japanese occupation and the official beginning of the Korean War, or as we often call it, the US War in Korea. And I should note that those 5 years were not a period of peace, but instead were a period of intense chaos and a kind of struggle among many different groups who had really different ideas about what self-determination would look like for Korea. My mother's family is from Sinuiju, which is a big city right on the border of China in what is now the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, right across the Yalu River from China. And they fled south at some point just before the outbreak of the Korean War, and went all the way down to Busan, which is the only city that never saw the war firsthand. But they were never able to return home to their, to my great-grandparents, to their family back home. And my father's family is from Seoul. And they unfortunately were in a region that saw the battlefront pass over them several times. So they saw a lot of death and violence, dodged shelling, and were displaced multiple times. The family was actually separated and got lost for, several months at a time. And my father also experienced the loss of two siblings in that conflict, as well as extreme poverty and malnutrition. So I think what's really interesting about this opportunity for me to be in conversation with Linda is Linda's almost like a bridge between this first and second generation of the survivors and the children of survivors, as someone who came when she was young, and has some of that experience of the first generation, and also a lot of the experience of the second generation. And I think for me as a second generation child of war survivors, there are a lot of aspects of their war trauma that I have felt kind of my whole life, but I actually didn't know what it was. Now looking back on my childhood, I can understand a little bit more about how it manifested. Big family secrets that I think are still, being revealed and exposed even, at my advanced age. Lots of emphasis on material care and physical safety and security. And, many other things that we'll hopefully get into later. So anyway, that's enough about me for now. But I want to maybe hand it back to Linda to help us begin to build a frame for our conversation.
Thank you, Jungwon. I'm just going to pause and take a breath and just acknowledge how much work we've each done to be able to share our stories with you all. So, in service of creating a framework and an intellectual container within which we can begin to unpack some of our experiences together, I firstly want to name that we don't talk about war. But we don't talk about war as a society. I have been to thousands of 12-step meetings. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Codependence Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And I believe I have owned close to nearly every 12-step daily meditation and daily reader that currently exists. And in many of our meetings, we take a reading from that 12-step reader as a topic for the day. And we talk about a lot of things. And yet we do not talk about war in the places that we go to talk about the things that we can't otherwise talk about. And so the day that I recognized that, I went to my home group, my 12-step home group, and I said, hey, can we talk about war? And every single person in that room, and this is a all A's are welcome home group. Every single person in that room either had direct experience with war, or it was in the parents' generation or the grandparents' generation, and that had a direct impact in terms of traumatization within the lineage that then impacted the ways in which parents were and were not able to turn up for their children, which then impacted nervous system development, which then impacted the uptake of coping mechanisms and coping skills. And so today we're going to funnel into talking about collective mass generational trauma within the context of war survivors and refugees and their children and grandchildren. And yet I want to also name that we can lateralize the key aspects of this out, the key aspects of mass historical generational traumas, to include the descendants of abducted and enslaved Africans, to the descendants of the genocided Indigenous peoples all over the world, and also to include the descendants of Holocaust survivors, the descendants of adult children of veterans with PTSD, as well as veterans with PTSD. There is so much to the aftermath of war and being raised by survivors of war. And I can cite you the research around this. Yeah, and this research was so helpful for me because back when I was trying to unpack myself in my life, there was no research about Vietnamese people. And so it was actually looking into the research around adult children of veterans, adult children of Holocaust survivors, and adult children of veterans with PTSD, and adult children of alcoholics that helped me to piece together and make sense of my life. And so I'll just share with you some of the research. Right, for adult children of veterans with PTSD, because for some of us as former child refugees, our parents fled because they actually served, right? They served in the conflict back then. So there's a secondary traumatization. So when you live with a traumatized individual, they are recounting or reliving horrific events. Yeah, and so we experience vicarious trauma as children. And then we also experience auto-hypnoid storytelling, meaning that the parent tells the same trauma narrative over and over again. And when we ask questions into that narrative, we're either shut down, the parent shuts down, or the parent explodes. We also may get met with a narrative silence from our parents when we ask questions, not in relation to their auto-hypnoid story, their dissociated storytelling, but when we just ask questions in general about their lives. Yeah, we get that narrative silence. We know from the research around adult children of Holocaust survivors that there's a pervasive loneliness and emptiness in the inner landscape as a result of not having parents who met the children emotionally in developmentally appropriate ways. Because for Holocaust survivors, being able to take care of the basic needs of children was considered more than enough. Yeah. Adult children of Holocaust survivors, as well as grandchildren, experience compensatory fantasies. Right? This is where survivors' progeny unconsciously try to repair the world for their parents, their grandparents, and for themselves. I also see this in descendants of Indigenous genocide, as well as including the descendants of residential school survivors. And Jungwon, I just want to name that I saw a response in your body and nervous system right then. Right, just these compensatory fantasies. Like we're trying to help our parents by making the world a better place for them, and therefore for us. We also experience over-identification with our parents and a fused identity with our parents because our parents' development got truncated. So they never got to individuate from a place of love and safety from their peoples, from their families. And so we then individuate from a place of fear, from a place of survival imperative from our own families of origin. As a result of trying to experience our own identity separate to that of our parents. And then there's also impaired self-esteem stemming from a minimization of my own experiences, my own life experiences compared to my parents' trauma. You know, my dad would say to me, in response to a kid taking my lunch or me hurting myself at school, right, elementary school, he would say, at least we're not getting bombs dropped on us anymore. You know, he would say things like, our dog eats better than our relatives back home. Yeah, and so there's my own self-esteem and self-worth gets impaired because my own experiences get minimized. There's a tendency towards catastrophizing. There's a worry that parental traumas will be repeated. I actually see this under the current administration, that for many of us, we're living in the reverberations of the return of authoritarianism. Yeah. And yet even prior to that, there's that underlying hypervigilance towards the fear that our parents' or grandparents' trauma will be re-experienced or repeated in our own lifetimes. And then behavioural challenges, right, at the nervous system, anxiety, guilt, hypervigilance, difficulties with interpersonal functioning. You know, the literature around adult children of alcoholics shows that parents who have their own unmet developmental dependency needs develop sorry, that when you are raised by parents who are alcoholic or preoccupied, we develop our own adaptive survival strategies. All or nothing thinking, control, perfectionism, a harsh inner critic, denial, and the inability to be in relationship with others as equals. And then in terms of the family dynamics themselves, there's homeostasis collusion and impaired mourning, which we can unpack later, right? Just offering you a framework that you can pursue yourselves, yeah? Your parents who are frightened and or frightening, that has impact on child development. And what happens for us as children is we start to take on the roles of the adults or the caregivers in the family system. We become adultified or parentified. We experience the burden of being a burden because we don't experience our parents taking delight in us, taking joy in us, being happy around us. And then we learn to take care of our attachment figures, our parents, in order to ensure household function. So I'm just going to take a big deep breath with you all, because that is the research literature. And yet in amongst that, there are the themes of displacement, of the loss of home, of psychological homelessness due to a disruption in a relationship, to land, to ancestors, to culture. There's survivor guilt, vicarious survivor guilt, traumatic homesickness. And songlines and storylines are broken. And then we overlay on top of that the challenges with racialized identity, the model minority myth, the grateful refugee who's now the model minority, or the grateful refugee who's now gratefully invisibilized labor, because we dare not be the criminal element. And then we collude with the model minority trope within this racialized landscape because it gives us more proximity to whiteness and separates us and distinguishes us from other Black and brown bodies. And so navigating invisibility versus hypervisibility is challenging, especially across generations, especially when trauma says exposure equals death. I'm going to pause and take a breath with you all. Because in amongst all of this, especially intergenerationally, is how we don't realize that war survival strategies can be mistaken for our parents' country of origin culture. Right? Don't rock the boat, be quiet. Yeah. Maintain one story outside the home to protect your family. Watch every penny. In graduate school, I learned that don't talk, don't trust, don't feel were the dysfunctional dynamics of an alcoholic family. And I was furious because, and I didn't have the words back then, but with what I know now, these are survival strategies under communism, fascism, or any sort of authoritarian regime. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel is how you manage to make plans to flee a country. And so this then begs the question, what is closure? Especially amongst Western archetypal narrative structures of the hero's journey. You know, how can we actually queer up the idea or the notion of closure where there's multiple layers and multiple narratives with you know, a lot of variety when it comes to closure, and what can healing look like from one generation to the next? And this is where I invite us to pause into, you know, traditional psychology asks what's wrong with you, and trauma-informed psychology asks what happened to you, and culturally informed psychology asks what happened to your peoples, and liberation psychology asks, and what continues to happen to you and to your people. And this is where I'd love to bring Jungwon into this conversation, because your work is so imperative and impactful and delightful in terms of bringing to life the narratives around grief and justice and war.
Thank you for sharing so openly and vulnerably about your experience. I'm just so moved by your entire journey and the spiritual, philosophical, and clinical framework that you've developed, which is so deeply informed by your own journey. It's really something to behold. I wish I had met you in my 20s. So I want to go back to this question that is posed by what you've called liberation psychology, which is how do we respond as a society to mass trauma caused by war, genocide, the Middle Passage, extreme racial persecution like Jim Crow in the United States, or what the Rohingya have experienced in Myanmar, and of course, holding very close in my heart what the people of Palestine are going through right now. And I can't help but think about the generational implications of what we're witnessing. So, this kind of brings me to a question that I've been preoccupied with, I think, really for decades, which is in the absence of conventional legal mechanisms for accountability and repair and justice, right? How might we arrive at some feeling of resolution, if not closure, some feeling of release? Or how might we change our relationship to the historical trauma? And I think these are questions that have really immeasurable stakes for humanity and for our planet. Just the day before yesterday, for example, there was an accident during some US and South Korea war drills. And I guess due to an error in punching in the coordinates, an American bomber plane dropped a big bomb, 500-pound bomb, on a residential village just near the DMZ, which is the most heavily militarized border in the world. And everybody's already on a hair trigger on the Korean Peninsula. There are nuclear bombs pointing north, pointing south. I mean, it's just a very tense situation. And 15 people were seriously injured. Homes were destroyed, and this is just a regular occurrence, and all of these munitions, all of these explosions cause, irreparable harm also to our planet. I think the bombing of Gaza alone caused a climate emission, greenhouse gas emission, that was greater than, dozens of countries combined for the entire year. So even if you are not someone who's directly impacted by historical war trauma, I think this is a question we absolutely have to address collectively, because the impacts actually will come for us all. And I want to kind of take a moment here and highlight a fascinating two-part conversation on science and non-duality that just happened between Naomi Klein and Gabor Mate. And I think they did a really fantastic job of discussing what happens when a people ritualize unprocessed trauma and how dangerous that becomes the conversation, I believe, is called Minds Under Siege, and it's about the weaponization of trauma. So, when people are in a, traumatized state, or maybe the next generation of people who have inherited trauma from their survivor parents, I think they're particularly vulnerable to manipulation, especially fear-based manipulation. I think there are also tons of health effects that we have to consider. I read just today that Yale anthropologist Catherine Panter-Brick just published a study about Syrian refugees who had experienced a mass atrocity. I believe the place is called Homa or Hama. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation to all the Arabic speakers. But the study is the first of its kind, and it shows the chemical markers of epigenetic trauma on the human genome, and that those chemical markers actually carry for 3 generations. So the question of, how we might disrupt the trauma loop, which animates the cycle of violence, is a pressing one. I would say it might even be one of the most urgent conundrums of our time. And to that question, I think part of the answer lies in ritualizing the healing, not the trauma.
Yes.
I really think that's how we find our way out. We ritualize the healing, not the trauma. And here I want to introduce the concept of Han, which is a Korean word for the embodied accumulation of grief and rage and resentment as a result of big, usually collective historical traumas. So when we talk about Han in a Korean cultural setting, we are referring to a kind of collective shared pain. And I think what is really useful about this is it provides perhaps a shorthand. I would love if we could mainstream the word Han so that we, people who come from these lineages that have been forged in the fire of colonialism, US imperial wars, of planetary destruction, which are all like 3 heads of a hydra, right? That we have this kind of shared frame of reference, that we carry this generational pain, that there is a sense of helplessness and resentment because of the lack of justice and accountability, and that this is embodied. It's in our bodies. I also want to say, I think Han provides a really interesting framework for liberation, because the presence of Han in our bodies insists on correcting the historical erasure of the wars and the atrocities that have affected us. So no matter how hard the Trump administration tries to go after our national archives, or to silence cultural workers, or to take over cultural institutions, or to eliminate curriculum that is really related to the violence that the United States has wrought all over the world, the US not being the only country, of course, but I'm here, so that's what I've been focused on. They can't erase the Han, because the Han lives in our bodies. And I think that even if the Korean War is referred to in US history textbooks as the forgotten war, or even if, we've only just begun to confront the mass atrocities that the US military committed in Vietnam during Vietnam's American War. I should also mention here that South Korea sent its own soldiers to fight alongside the Americans, and they also committed terrible atrocities in Vietnam, for which I feel deep shame and regret. But even if we are kind of trying to fend off all of these attempts at historical denialism, they can't touch the Han. The Han lives inside of us. It animates so many of us in our work, in our commitment to human rights, in our creativity, in our community organizing. And I think in that sense, we can and must lean into ritualizing our healing, ritualizing our acknowledgement and honoring, and then eventually release of our Han as an act of community care. It kind of fits into an abolitionist framework, right? Where we begin to understand the state is not the right mechanism. The state is not going to provide repair or reparations to war survivors of US imperialism. And even if they did, it wouldn't be right. It wouldn't bring back relatives who were lost, separated, and killed. It wouldn't give me, well, maybe it would allow me to finally visit my mother's, hometown, but who knows? I think it's kind of this, I've come to this realization at this stage in life where, I'm done waiting around for someone to acknowledge what's been done. We actually need to bear witness to each other, and we need to do the repair. And so creating community-based rituals and ceremonies designed to kind of transmute our Han is something we can take into our own hands. It feels very exciting, in a sense, to claim that agency for our community well-being. And I think, in doing this, we can complement individual therapeutic modalities with this kind of overlay of community-based ritual healing, which provides some socio-emotional relief. And in doing so, I mean, one of the interesting kind of benefits of this is that we offer our own form of narrative intervention. We are correcting the historical record. I mean, plenty of scholars are doing this in their books and their research, and doing this together, we are able to offer another form of that narrative intervention. So I would love to take this out of the realm of our words and our kind of intellectual thinking for a bit, and maybe share a video so that some of you can actually feel what we're talking about. I'm going to share this 4.5-minute video clip of a grief transmutation ceremony that I produced in deep collaboration with a nonprofit organization called Women Cross DMZ and their national campaign, Korea Peace Now. It's an organization dedicated toward formally ending the Korean War. And in this video, we are guided through a kind of process of grief acknowledgement and release by the ritual performance artist and shaman, Do-hee Lee, who comes from Jeju, Korea. So yeah, Sarah, if you could cue that video, that would be great.
있을 줄 알아요. 그럽시다. 우리 조상님들 못하셨어요. 우리 조상님들 못하셨어요. 대신 해드리세요. 아일랜드에서 정착하면서 사는 수다 고유 고국의 통일을 기리며 이곳에보다 워싱턴 DC 아나코스탄 땅에 우리의 자손들 모여 수다 우리의 바램은 어찌 보면 간단합니다. 어렵고 복잡한 것이 아니에 어찌 보면 간단한 것으로 70년을 질질 끌며 여기까지 왔으나 우리가 원하는 건 이산 가족이 상봉이 되고 달라진 자연이 하나가 되고 달라진 땅이 하나가 되고 달라진 민족이 하나가 되고 아름다운 문화가 하나가 되고 우리의 소원은 통일을 이루고 우리의 땅에 진정한 독립을 기원하러 여기에 모였으나 that's the only way we can do this.
Thank you. So I just wanted to explain a couple of things and then ask Linda for some insight. One is that the fabric knots you saw and the people kind of untangling those knots comes from a shamanic ritual called Sipkimgut, and it refers to untangling the knots of your ancestors' suffering. And then the other note that I just wanted to mention is, this was, I think, the first time for me, and I think the first time for many of the 220 or so participants there, to really experience a kind of Korean indigenous healing modality in community with one another. So I'll stop there and pose the question to Linda. We had an intergenerational group there. We had first generation war survivors, second generation people like me, and even third generation grandchildren of war survivors, everybody expressed a deep sense of release. There were lots of tears. There was a lot of laughter. People after the ceremony mentioned, I feel so much different. I feel so much lighter. There's a Korean expression, but maum puroso, my heart was unbound. And so I know all of that happened, and I know what I experienced in the room. But I don't quite understand in psychological terms why this type of ritual accomplished the results that it did. What happened there? I would love to kind of get your analysis on that.
Jungwon, I've actually watched this video 5 times because it was just so emotionally striking to me what has been created, what moved through you and moved through other people, that confluence together in this creation, this fusion. And each generation is going to have their own experiences. And we know that trauma is held in the body as frozen terror, because trauma is inescapability. Trauma is inescapability. So there's that frozen terror and the frozen truncated attachment cry and the frozen silent scream. The inability to reach towards our caregivers. Yeah. And when you have the first generation is racked, like totally racked by the horrors of war and fleeing and the dismemberment of war, the dismemberment of their family, their village, their culture. And the second generation is living with the aftermath of being raised by parents who are traumatized or traumatizing, as well as society's response. Yeah, and the resources that society has available in this other new place. And so for me, being generation 1.5, I do feel like I'm at the bridge in so many ways. And I wish I had have met you when I was in my 20s, the you that you are now. But the third generation wants to remember. Right? They have the capacity to fuse tradition and old ways with the aspects of this current landscape that they're living in. Yeah, and they have more capacity to, because they're not living in the direct of the aftermath of war. And the fourth generation is the generation that risks forgetting. And so we see these nuances here, and around trauma and around narrative and around the complexities of remembering and forgetting. And we know that trauma is unspeakable. And I know that the first task of grief is to come to terms with reality. Yeah, and this is where denial is such an adaptive survival strategy that allows us to stuff things down and keep moving forward. And so to be able to name the impacts and the aftermath of war upon yourself and your forebears is the first task of grief. And especially for our inner child, you can't grieve your inner child until you bring your inner child inside your circle of worthiness. Right? The losses and the longings of your inner child have to be placed inside your circle of worthiness. And it was only after I did that I could place the losses and the longings of my parents who gave up the best years of their lives to start afresh in a new country. Right? I could then place their losses and longings inside my circle of worthiness. Yeah. And so the grief ritual gives us a container and a framework within which we can allow that which we may not have yet got words for to begin to surface and emerge through our bodies, through our soma, this somatic liberation, this somatic abolitionism, this collective somatic liberation and abolitionism, where the rhythm and the movement helps us to stay tethered to something that prevents us from collapsing back into that frozenness. Yeah. And there is something to that tempo that creates a collective heartbeat. Yeah. And that synchrony that creates that collective heartbeat is also one of the primordial ancient mechanisms of culture and cultural architecture. Song, story, movement, silence, interpersonal rhythmicity, cultural rhythms, connected to the landscape, connecting us to each other. Like this is what happened. Right? And within that, there's a vibration. And that vibration begins to shake through the armory that many of us have created in order to protect ourselves. That armoring at the surface level of the body, that armoring around our viscera, that armoring around our vocal mechanisms, which is, the up here in the throat, but the armoring also continues around the heart, around the diaphragm, around the pelvic diaphragm. Yeah. And then that begins to move things.
Mm-hmm.
And then
does it disrupt the homeostasis collusion, which I should just explain because I had to ask what that was the first time we met, but it's kind of an unspoken agreement among a family and a community to not rock the boat, not to ask the questions that might open a scary can of worms. But when you talk about the shaking, it makes me think that it's a kind of shaking you out of the collusion.
Yes, because that homeostasis collusion, which expresses as like a rigidity in the family system, also expresses internally. So I have also the things I can't even say to myself. Right. And that which is unspeakable to another actually then becomes unspeakable within inside ourselves. We keep secrets in here. And we also keep secrets from ourselves and we clamp down. You know that thing where you want to say something and then you're like, no?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so that constriction inside, over time, that constriction becomes even more firmer, more stronger. Yeah. And
I think also,
so go ahead. Mm.
Well, it just the way that you're describing the drumming and the song and the shaking, I feel like there's an element in here of cathartic joy that when you kind of get into this trance state, if you're really willing to kind of let yourself go and be held,
Mm-hmm.
you need a capable ritual practitioner. You can't just surrender to anybody. But if you really let yourself go, there is just this kind of cathartic joy, right? So in that ceremony in 2023, there was, as we were dancing, there was also lots of shouting, happy shouting. It got a little, and the elders actually were the ones who were shouting the most, and dancing the most wildly in a sense. And then there's also this element, I want to say that the idea of cathartic joy or joyful catharsis is in Korean called hung, and it's often talked about as like an antidote to han. And then there's a third element that also is part of this beautiful, I don't know, like a triple yin yang, called Jung, which is this web of kinship and mutual responsibility and interdependence. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is that this ritual would not have done the same thing for me if I did it alone. Like if I watched a video of Dohi and danced around in my room by myself, it wouldn't have had the same effect. But we were there together. So that was like the Jung, the togetherness, the web of relationality. And I was thinking about this, why that's a necessary part of the ritualized healing. I think it's what you said about the horror that the first generation carries and the second generation feels intuitively. So it's like, you know, when you're a kid, I don't know if you have this in Australia, but here in the United States, they have like haunted house or like house of horrors. So you go to an amusement park around Halloween and it's this like nightmarish thing and things pop out and scare you. And there's like peeled grapes to look like eyeballs. And it's terrifying. I mean, as a kid, it's terrifying. You know, I was always really, really scared. And it's kind of like, you know, you don't kind of feel like you can't go into the house of horrors alone. But if you're together and you're holding hands, it's easier to face the horrors. And I feel like that's something I want to just carry forward into this moment as we are witnessing collectively many horrors around the world, many scary things at home. The idea of community, relationality, interdependence, mutual aid, mutual care, reciprocity, all of those things, like that we are much stronger as a woven fabric than as individual strands. And that's obviously not a new idea, but I feel like that's kind of another thing that was happening, you know, in that ceremony.
Yes. And you, as a somatic therapist, right, it's the diaphragm. Yeah, when there's horror and terror, the diaphragm becomes so constricted, and then we disconnect ourselves from our capacity for joy or for grief, because any movement in the diaphragm is going to release the silent scream, it's going to release the horrors. And then we create even more armoring to protect ourselves and our families from that which we're hiding inside, and yet it bursts out. It bursts out. Yeah. And so that fine line between grief and joy is actually in the body. And for many second generation, we can't experience joy unless it's through addiction, right? It's through a dissociated state that we can actually touch upon pleasure. Yeah. And so to actually come together to liberate the diaphragm so that we can actually liberate our capacity for joy is so necessary, like so incredibly necessary. And I find that in the activist circles that I swing in, you know, the imperative for laughter, for rest, for joy, and for grief and for rage is how we are moving so much of our nervous system activations through our bodies together so that we can engage in the change that we want to see in the world from a place of love, from a place of fierce and unrelenting love.
I'm feeling so many feelings, and I just want you to know that after we're done, I'm probably going to go outside and release a silent scream that I've been carrying for, 55 years. I'll wait until the Zoom is done.
Well, as you do that, if it feels right for you, you can imagine yourself screaming into my body. Yeah.
Or we could hold hands and scream across a canyon together.
Yeah. And that our scream is landing upon the earth. Old. Yeah. As well as echo back to us.
As a song.
As a song, because this is what, I mean, it's existential. It is so deeply existential, right? That I am real, that you are real. What you went through was real. What your peoples went through was real. And that is over now. And yes, there is still ongoing things around that are happening in the world around us. However, we can celebrate these small, or celebrate bit at the, we can commemorate, we can name. Yeah. While also naming the complexities that for Koreans, it's not over. Right? The country is still separated.
I think that we
Mm.
want to leave some time for Q&A, and also I wanted to just check in with Zaya and Maurizio to see if they have other questions, other things they'd like to bring to the conversation. Yeah, just checking in with you both.
Aye.
What a rich conversation and offering, and the video just went straight into my body. I could feel it with every fiber of my being, and that kind of longing for collective healing. Like for so long, we've been taught in the West that we have to sit on a couch with a therapist and do individual trauma healing. And I think now collectively we are waking up to the limitations of that. And I could feel the deep longing in my body, seeing the Korean shaman and the group together in those states of grief and joy and ecstasy. And it feels like it's the most natural flow
State.
of energy
Yeah.
and state. So, oof. And so many questions, but maybe just if we could touch on how the trauma, but also in the healing, could live differently for people who have left the ancestral lands and for those who are still there. Does the trauma manifest differently, and also does the healing look differently? Maybe you can touch something on that. And also the whole homeostatic collusion is
Yeah.
huge. Collusion is huge. I mean, this is a conversation by itself, but also maybe Linda, you can touch on how can we create spaces, again, probably collective, in which it's safe to open, because that had a function. The silencing had a function for our ancestors to survive. So how can we begin to open that without disturbing a delicate balance that is there?
And we can also add that this attempt to healing, can it be done safely when we're still under the threat of fascism, genocide, and colonialism? Which brings another layer to this. Can we go there now? Because, yeah.
I know we threw a lot of questions here, so
Oh,
maybe
I'll just respond to the first question about how it might look different for people in diaspora and for people, in the root country, by sharing that on my recent trip to Korea in December, I met a shaman and also a singer there who actually specializes in performing grief rituals for victims of historical atrocities. So there, of course, are going to be differences, right? Like she's performing those ceremonies in Korean. There's no translation needed. Everybody actually probably knows the songs better. So for us in diaspora, we are reconnecting to our root culture through ceremony, which also contains another layer of loss and grief, cultural loss, linguistic loss, and then the actual kind of, reconnecting to our ancestral practices is another form of healing that very specific grief. So I think there are differences, and there's just such a common pulse.
Mm. And I'll just pick up on the threads that landed for me from your questions, Zaya. We can't grieve when we're in survival mode. Right? My parents couldn't grieve for 35 years, and it was only when the Syrian boat people phenomenon happened, or crisis actually happened, that my parents looked at the newspaper and went, "Wow, that was us." And there was actually a big wave of post-traumatic grief that moved through the Vietnamese diaspora community for those of us who are boat people as a result of seeing the Syrian boat people. And we could actually then say the words like, that was us, like that was in past tense. And yet, we can't grieve when we're in survival mode, but we can have these small moments of joy, these little pockets of resistance, in terms of the ways in which we continue to hold on to that will to survive. And this is where we also then recognize how trauma impacts each generation differently. And we offer choice and agency and nuance and complexity around what would be helpful for folks of each generation in regards to opening the box and closing the box.
Yeah, very important.
I also wanted to address Maurizio's very interesting question of how do we do this safely in places where fascism or, direct aggression present a very tangible threat. What I think is really interesting about ceremony is there can be an element of subterfuge to it. I'm trying to imagine somebody from the current administration's anti-woke unit stepping into our grief transmutation ritual and trying to make sense of what's actually happening. And I don't even know that it would be legible to them as a narrative intervention. So I think actually this is a really interesting and smart way to assert ourselves and to resist. It's maybe not a direct, like I'm, posting this thing on Twitter or, making some kind of proclamation or manifesto to the Department of Education. But it's, we are doing this for ourselves and by ourselves, for each other and, with each other.
My Alaska Native friends would talk about how their potlatch ceremonies would get taken away, right? They weren't allowed to come together to share food anymore, but they could have tea with Bible study. And so everyone would come together to drink tea and have Bible study. And so they would then use that, which was forced upon them, to engage in making sure that everyone in the community had what they needed, which was the purpose of potlatch. We see this through Central America and South America, where Catholicism has taken on a lot of indigeneity because it was a religion that was forced upon the local peoples, and yet the local peoples infused indigeneity into the practice of Catholicism.
Not to mention Santeria, Voodoo, all of these African forms of religion that were syncretized into Christianity with saints that corresponded to their deities. There's a long tradition of this. Very smart.
Yeah. And the first thing the church did in Europe when they were killing the wise, the witches, those who knew the ways of nature, was also to ban grieving. Yeah. So collectively, there was forgetting of how to grieve as a group, as a community. And I just wanted to say, there was a question like, what do you do when you're in the midst of genocide and war? And I wanted to bring that image that has just impacted me so deeply from Gaza a few days ago. Right. During the Ramadan, how the Palestinians built that long table in the midst of the rubble, and no community gather around tiny bits of food. And that is the only source of resilience or attempt to mend those deep wounds. It was just embodied. It was just such a powerful image. Like, despite all, we can still sit together. So that kind of remembrance of grieving and being and sharing, it feels like it's a collective longing and it's so strong at this time. Thank you so much for this deep, deep space you offered us, and so much I feel is moving in my body, in my heart, and I think for all of us, this is so alive. And thank you for planting lots of seeds for us to allow us to begin this journey, and individually and collectively. And yes, I'm at loss with words just because I feel very raw inside, and which means it's very potent, the space we shared. So thank you so much, both. Thank you everyone who joined. This is huge topic. In 1 hour, we cannot barely touch the surface. And as Sen, we are committing to continue offering this space and continue these conversations together. So please tune in, and at the beginning of June, we will have a week-long event that will be just focusing on this conversation of healing intergenerational trauma. This meeting will be recorded. We will share the recordings and all the resources that Linda and Jungwon shared generously with us. And I hope we can continue this conversation with the two of you, and maybe even create a deeper space, longer space that we can come and be with you.
And maybe we can come up a way to create those rituals as a community, starting with Zoom, and then one day we'll be able to do it.
I would love that. I mean, I think one of the big learnings for me is how important it is for us to do this in 3 dimensions together, to be able to really, co-regulate through our communal healing process. So I know you've probably dropped our various website links in the chat. I am working on, I'm developing an event series similar to the one in the video, but it will actually be cross-cultural for people who come from lineages affected by colonialism and imperialism and war, as a way of actually learning about each other's Han and sharing our transmutation practices with each other. So if you are interested in learning where and when those will be, at the bottom of my website, there's like an email sign up. I actually have never sent a mass email yet. So don't worry, you won't get a lot of email from me, but I'll probably send like 1 email when the times and dates are confirmed. It is my wish and my prayer that Linda, Zaya, Maurizio, Lisa, and maybe some of you can be together at some of those events too. We shall see.
And we will share also this data, this information in the newsletter people will receive tomorrow, so everybody's aware.
And Linda, anything you would like to offer for people to follow up with you? And I know
follow up with me. I have a website. I send out a monthly newsletter. It's, a way of being in connection and in community with each other. Do the things that help you to remember who you are, and stop doing the things that cause you to forget who you are. And they are my grandfather's words. Right? And we don't have to be experts in language or ritual or the stories of our people in order to begin. And begin wherever you're at with whatever resources you have access to.
beautiful gift. Thank you for this beautiful offering.
Yeah. I love the sweetness of it, the way your word have been entering in my body with such ease and delicacy that has been able to touch me at the core without any shake. You were able to avoid, and I feel like a tingle inside on my diaphragm, actually, Linda, as you were mentioning. So Thank you for kindness and your precision, both of you, and what you're sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for holding space for the conversations I really believe we need to be having right now. You all are doing incredible work. I mean, your community is amazing. Your catalog of past talks are just, they're incredible. Really, really important topics.
Together.
Beautifully curated.
Long
Yeah.
we are coming together.
Yeah. Stick with us, all of you.
Be well and deeply, deeply
Thank
grateful.
you
Wisdom.
so much.
Yeah.